Have you ever heard of the Battle of the Porongos? No, exactly, because what happened there was so brutal that both sides agreed never to tell. But a survivor wrote it all down, and what he saw that November night explains why the Farroupilha Revolution isn't in movies, TV shows, or anywhere. September 20th, 1835. While you celebrate this date today, you don't know that it began with a man forced to choose between killing his own cousin or watching his city burn. He had 30 seconds to decide. What he chose is what you'll find out. But first, let me ask you a question. Why did a war between Brazilians last 10 years while we expelled the Dutch in 5? The answer lies in a word you use every day without knowing its origin. A word born in this war and that reveals Brazil's best-kept secret. We almost became two countries, and with just one vote in Parliament, you could now need a passport to visit Porto Alegre. Who cast that vote, why, and what did he ask in return that changed it forever? How does Brazil work? That's what you'll discover now. But I warn you, once you learn the truth about the Farroupilha Revolution, you'll understand why your country is the way it is today. Then you discovered there was a word that changed everything, a word that didn't even exist before 1822, empire, the Empire of Brazil. And in 1835, this empire was ruled by a child who still had nightmares about monsters under his bed. Pedro de Alcântara, João Carlos Leopoldo Salvador, Bibiano Francisco Xavier de Paula Leocádio Miguel Gabriel Rafael Gonzaga. That was the full name of your emperor. He was 9 years old. He woke at 5 a.m. to study Latin, French, English, German, geography, math, fencing, and dance. Yes, dance, because emperors need to know how to stand their ground while the country burns. And it was literally burning. While Pedro II memorized Latin verbs in the São Cristóvão Palace, the real Brazil, the Brazil you never saw in books, was falling apart. Valens 1835. Cabanos slitting the throats of Portuguese people in the middle of the street, 30,000 dead in 5 years. 1/3 of the population of Pará. Indigenous children impaled in public squares. But in Rio de Janeiro, the little emperor was learning the difference between a fish fork and a dessert fork. São Luís do Maranhão the same year, 3,000 escaped slaves controlling the countryside, farms burning nightly, sugar mill owners found headless in their beds. The empire's response: they sent a general who had never set foot in Maranhão and who died of malaria within 3 months. Salvador, still in 1835, the Sabinada Sabbath Day War exploding. Doctors, lawyers, and teachers taking up arms to separate Bahia from Brazil. What did the imperial government order? Ships took 4 months to arrive because they stopped at every port along the way to refuel. And in the south, something different was brewing because while the other revolts were outbursts of rage, desperation, and hot blood, Rio Grande do Sul was calculating, planning, waiting. The gauchos weren't runaway slaves. They weren't desperate caboclos. They were French-speaking residents who had libraries at home, who sent their children to study in Paris. They were rich, very rich, and for that very reason, much more dangerous because the empire knew how to crush a revolt of the poor. It sent the army, shot a few hundred, arrested the leaders, and it was over. But a revolt of the rich, a revolt of the people who financed the empire itself, that was another story. Rio Grande do Sul produced 40% of the food that fed Brazil's slaves. Think about it. Every black person who cut sugarcane in Pernambuco, who harvested coffee in São Paulo, who mined gold in Minas Gerais, ate gaucho shack. Without the South, the slave system would cease. Without the slave system, the empire would cease. Without the empire, Brazil would cease to exist. And the gauchos knew this. Oh, if they did. And the gauchos knew exactly how to use this power. Because while the empire suppressed other revolts with bayonets, negotiations with the South would be necessary. Or at least that's what they thought on that night of September 3rd, 1835. The farm was located where Pedras Altas is today, 20 kilometers from Porto Alegre, owned by Bento Gonçalves da Silva, the man who had saved the empire 3 times. He fought in the Cisplatina War, commanded troops in the Confederation of Ecuador, was a colonel in the Imperial Army, had the government's trust, and was about to betray it. But here's what nobody tells you. Bento Gonçalves didn't want independence, not at first. He wanted something much simpler. He wanted the gaucho shark to pay the same taxes as the Uruguayan shark, 25% versus 4%. It was basic math. Foreign products were killing the local economy. In that room, lit only by candles, were men you need to know. Domingo José de Almeida, who would become the finance minister of the Rio Grande Republic, Onofre Pires, who controlled half of Porto Alegre's commerce, Vicente da Fontoura, owner of land stretching from Rio Pardo to the border. They weren't romantic revolutionaries. They were businessmen making calculations. Each day of unfair taxes cost 1,000 head of cattle to rot. Each week, a meatpacking plant closed. Each month, dozens of families migrated to Uruguay. And then someone put a letter on the table. It came from José Artigas, the old Uruguayan exile in Paraguay. It promised arms, ammunition, and most importantly, international recognition if Rio Grande seceded. Argentina also signaled support. The young Brazilian empire was surrounded by neighbors who would love to see it fragmented. But the crucial detail lay in a second letter. This one came from Rio de Janeiro, from inside the palace. Someone very close to the little emperor warned that the government planned to appoint a new provincial president, Antonio Rodrigues Fernandes Braga, known for crushing the revolution in Pará with extreme brutality. It was now or never. Bento Gonçalves stood tall, 1.85 mm, 6 ft1 in, at a time when the average height was 160 mm, 5 ft4 in. Scars from 20 battles on his face, the voice that commanded 5,000 lancers. Gentlemen, we have attempted dialogue. We have sent petitions, we have begged. The boy emperor doesn't even know we exist. The regents treat us like a colony. So we will be what they fear. We will be free. 20 men, 20 signatures, 20 fates sealed. In 2 weeks, Porto Alegre would be taken. But first, they needed something only Bento Manuel Ribeiro could achieve. And this is where the story gets really interesting. Bento Manuel Ribeiro was the kind of man who made the devil doubt his intentions. 6 feet 3 inches of pure muscle and contradiction, a war hero with 200 confirmed kills, a professional traitor who would change sides 7 times. And on that morning of September 20th, he was the key to everything. Because Bento Manuel had something the revolutionaries needed, the absolute trust of President Fernandes Braga. They were compadres. Their children played together, dined at the same table every Sunday. And while Braga slept peacefully that September dawn, his best friend marched with 200 men to arrest him. 6 a.m. fog thick as milk blanketed Porto Alegre. The city of 8,000 souls still slept. The few who were awake saw the horsemen pass and thought it was a routine patrol. After all, Bento Manuel commanded the guard the Enha Bridge. It still stands today. You can visit. That day it separated 2 Brazils. On the other side, the empire. On this side, a republic about to be born. When Bento Gonçalves crossed that bridge, there was no turning back. The government palace stood where Praça da Matriz is today. Fernandes Braga slept on the 2nd floor. His wife Bernardina woke to the sound of footsteps, many footsteps. She shook her husband. Antonio, there are people in the house. When Braga opened the bedroom door, he found Bento Manuel, his friend, pointing a pistol at his head. Sorry, friend, Bento Manuel said, but Rio Grande do Sul needs to be free. And here lies the most pathetic moment in Brazilian history. The provincial president, the emperor's representative dressed in his wife's clothes, lipstick, wig, and a shawl covering his face. He tried to escape disguised as a woman. He was recognized by the shoemaker himself at the back door. The man repairing his boots looked at that ridiculous figure and said, Dr. Braga, it's you. The humiliation was complete. The president of Rio Grande do Sul in a dress, being escorted through the streets as the city woke up. Men laughing, women limping, children pointing. Within 3 hours, the news had spread throughout Porto Alegre. But the genius wasn't the seizure of power. It was what Bento Gonçalves did afterward. He didn't declare independence, he didn't shoot anyone, he didn't loot anything. He took the key to the provincial safe, counted the money, $18,000 and $400,000, and made a receipt, an official receipt stamped and signed, stating that the money belonged to Rio Grande do Sul, not to the revolutionaries. Do you know why? Because they didn't see themselves as rebels. They saw themselves as the legitimate government, defending the rights of the province. And for the next 40 days, they kept the entire bureaucracy running, taxes being collected, salaries being paid, courts ruling as if nothing had changed, except that everything had. And the empire was about to respond. And the empire responded as the empire always did, with brute force and administrative incompetence in equal measure. because while Bento Gonçalves was organizing a functional government in Porto Alegre, Rio de Janeiro, a 9-year-old boy was taking calligraphy lessons. The Regency, which governed in the name of Little Pedro, received the news in October. It took 23 days for the information to arrive. The president was deposed, dressed as a woman. Porto Alegre was taken without a shot, the provincial coffers in the hands of the rebels. Father Feijó, the regent, flew into a rage so violent that he broke the council table. But here lies the problem. The empire was broken. The other revolts had drained the treasury. The army was spread thin from Pará to Mato Grosso. The navy had more debts than ships. The solution was to appoint Marshal Sebastião Barreto Pereira Pinto, 71. Deaf in one ear with a red eye, he hadn't ridden a horse for 5 years because of chronic hemorrhoids. This was the man who would reconquer Rio Grande do Sul. Barreto arrived in Porto Alegre in January 1836. He found the city already retaken by imperial troops from Rio Pardo, but surrounded by 6,000 Farroupos. And so began the most foolish siege in Brazilian military history. The Farroupos controlled the entire campaign, all the livestock, all the production. Porto Alegre was an imperial island in a turbulent sea. Food was available only by boat. When the Farroupos did release water, the wells were poisoned with animal carcasses. Firewood. The surrounding forests were enemy territory. In 3 months, the price of flour rose 10,000%. An egg cost what a worker earned in a day. Cats disappeared from the streets, dogs too. Rats were sold for their weight in gold on the black market. And then the unstoppable began. Dona Maria Clemencia, wife of an imperial major, was the first to suggest the Santa Casa cemetery. Fresh bodies with flesh still on their bones. It wasn't cannibalism, technically not. At first, it was bones boiled to make broth, cartilage to thicken soup. But in April, when they found the Coiro selling pieces of human thigh as imported veal, the line had been crossed. Meanwhile, the Farroupos waited, eating barbecue, drinking wine, playing guitar around the campfires. Gauchos and imperials met on the river to fish, chatted, exchanged tobacco, and then returned to their positions. It was the most civilized and most savage war at the same time. Civilized among the combatants, savage for the civilians caught in the middle. But in June 1836, everything changed. Bento Manuel, the man who had handed Porto Alegre over to the Farroupos, appeared in the imperial camp. He had switched sides for the first time. Bento Manuel switched sides for the first time, and no one was really surprised because everyone knew the nature of the man, born to betray. But what no one yet understood was the method in his madness. "I came to serve the empire," he told Marshal Barreto, still in his rag uniform. "I discovered information worth an army, and it was indeed valuable. Troop positions, passwords, attack plans, weak points. Within a week, the Imperials retook 3 cities using Bento Manuel's information. Bento Gonçalves was furious and ordered Bento Manuel hanged in effigy. A straw doll dressed in his uniform was hanged in Piratine Square. He declared that the traitor would be shot on sight. The price for his head was 5,000 reis. 3 months later, in October 1836, Bento Manuel appeared at the Farroupilha camp, alone, unarmed, with a letter. "I have come to ask for forgiveness and to serve the Republic," he told Bento Gonçalves, who had his pistol cocked and brought the imperial plans for the next 6 months. Anyone else would have been shot on the spot. But Bento Manuel had something no one else had. He knew both sides intimately. He knew every weakness, every secret, every corrupt officer, every password, every supply route. And most importantly, he was militarily brilliant. At the Battle of Seville, commanding the Farroupos again, he destroyed an imperial force twice his size, using a tactic he had learned from the Imperials themselves. But in 1837 he switched sides again. Then in 1838, 1839, 1840, 1841, 7 times in total. And most insanely, both sides always took him back. Why? Because Bento Manuel was too useful to kill. Years later, as an old man, he revealed the truth to his grandson. "I never betrayed anyone. I was the messenger pigeon of peace. When they wanted to negotiate without admitting it, they told me to switch sides. Each betrayal was a message and the proof. In 1950, historians found letters from Caxias to Bento Gonçalves, using Bento Manuel as an intermediary. Peace proposals, terms of surrender, secret negotiations all going through the traitor. But the most ingenious betrayal occurred in October 1842. Bento Manuel, serving the Farrapos for the fourth time, convinced Bento Gonçalves to attack São Gabriel. He assured them that the city was unguarded. It was a lie. There were 3,000 Imperials hidden in wait, but Bento Manuel had also lied to the Imperials, saying that the Farrapos would come with 500 men. They came with 2,000. The result? The two armies met, both surprised, both unprepared, and fled. That's right. The two armies fled from each other without a battle, each believing they had fallen into a trap. Bento Manuel had created a perfect stalemate, and in the midst of the confusion, stole the war treasure from both sides. Bento Manuel had stolen the treasure from both sides, but there was something far worse being stolen in those years, the innocence of an entire generation. Because in 1844, Rio Grande do Sul was creating something Brazil had never seen. Child soldiers, not by choice but by necessity. After 9 years of war, there were no men left. The cemeteries were full of fathers, grandfathers, uncles. The boys remained 12, 13, 14 years old enough to play soldier, except the rifles were real and the bullets were unforgiving. José Ferreira, 13, son of a widow from Bagé, forcibly enlisted by the Farroupilhas in January 1944, killed in March, beheaded after surrendering. The Empire did not take children prisoner. They were too much work to feed. But what turned this war into a machine? It was a decision made simultaneously on both sides, as if by agreement. The Black Lancers, slaves, promised freedom if they fought. Simple as that, except it wasn't simple. It was a logistical and moral nightmare no one had foreseen. The Farrapos, Brazilian slaves, first promised, "Fight for us and you will be free." 2,000 slaves enlisted. They received lances because rifles were too expensive to waste on black people. They were trained for 3 weeks. Sent to the front lines, the Empire responded with the same promise. 3,000 slaves, same lances, same fate. And then the unthinkable happened. In the Battle of the Gourds, Black Farrapos faced Imperial Blacks. Brothers from the Senzala killing brothers in chains. All fighting for a freedom neither side truly intended to grant. Because here's the dirty secret. Both sides were terrified of what they had created. Thousands of armed and trained slaves who had tasted white blood, who had learned military tactics, who knew they could kill their own gentlemen. That was when David Canabaro, Farrapo commander, received that letter. Caxias proposed the unthinkable. Eliminate your blacks and we'll eliminate ours. Then we'll negotiate peace. On November 14, 1844, a cold dawn, Canabaro ordered the Black Lancers to camp separately, without sentries, unarmed, to rest, he said. At 4 a.m., the Imperial cavalry attacked, but only attacked the black camp. The whites, 200 strong. They watched as 300 Black Lancers were massacred. Men who had fought for 9 years for the Rio Grande do Sul Republic, killed not by the enemy, but by the betrayal of their own commanders. Joaquim Teixeira Nunes, the grandson, the only Farrapo commander who protested, was found dead a week later. Suicide, they said, with 3 shots to the back. The few blacks who escaped fled to Uruguay. Their descendants still live there, still tell the story, still keep it. Hatred. The few black people who escaped the massacre fled to Uruguay, and it was precisely there that they discovered the most sordid truth of this war. Because in Uruguay they found the men who financed it all, the men who profited from every death, the men who prolonged the war when it could have ended. Juan Manuel de Rosas, dictator of Argentina, a man who personally beheaded opponents to save bullets, who kept the heads of his enemies in glass jars in his office, who forced everyone to wear red, the Federalist color under penalty of death. Rosas had a dream that haunts South America to this day, rebuilding the viceroyalty of the Rio de la Plata, Argentina. Uruguay, Paraguay, and Rio Grande do Sul, united under the rags, was the perfect opportunity. Since 1836, Argentine money had been flowing into Rio Grande. Not much, never enough to win, just enough to keep fighting. Rosas didn't want the Farrapos to win. He wanted them to bleed Brazil dry. 30,000 pesos in weapons, 20,000 in ammunition. Uniformed horses, even Argentine doctors. Everything was documented in letters now in Buenos Aires. Letters that Brazil tried to buy for $1 million in 1920 to burn. But in 1842, something changed. The Farrapos were secretly negotiating peace with the Empire. Caxias had offered honorable terms, full amnesty, incorporation into the imperial army, even possible provincial autonomy. That's when Rosas played his dirtiest card. He had a spy in Bento Gonçalves' office. Domingos José de Almeida, the finance minister Farroupilha, was paid 1,000 pesos a month to report everything. When Rosas learned of the negotiations, he didn't wait a day. He leaked everything to the Rio de Janeiro newspaper, Correio Mercantil, but he didn't leak the truth. He leaked a distorted version, in which the Farrapos demanded total independence, the expulsion of all Brazilians, and a military alliance with Argentina against the empire. The scandal exploded. Pedro II, now 16, was furious. The young emperor, who had been inclined toward peace, had completely changed. Traitors don't negotiate, he said. Traitors surrender or die. Negotiations died there. The war continued for another 3 years. 15,000 deaths that shouldn't have happened. 15,000 Brazilians dead because of an Argentine dictator who played chess with human lives. But Rosas miscalculated, because prolonging the war created a hatred so deep between the Gauchos and the Argentines that it persists to this day. When peace finally came, the Farrapos discovered the manipulation and swore revenge. 10 years later, in the Battle of Caseros, it was the Gaucho Knights of Brazil who overthrew Rosas from power. Bento Gonçalves died first, but his men were there collecting the debt. In Argentine blood, the Gauchos proved their loyalty to Brazil, but that was later. First, March 1st, 1845 had to happen, the day that marked 10 years of slaughter. They ended with a handshake over a mud puddle, Ponche Verde, a soggy field near Dom Pedrito. On one side, Caxias with 8,000 men. On the other, David Canabaro with 3,000. All exhausted, all wanting to go home, all pretending they still wanted to fight. The real negotiations had taken place a month earlier. In secret, through whom? Bento Manuel, of course, in his 7th and final switch of sides, delivering the final terms that no one could refuse because no one could stand it anymore. The terms were surreal in their generosity. The Farrapos were not surrendering. They were being invited to join the empire. All officers would retain their ranks. No one would be punished. War debts would be forgiven. The Farrapos soldiers would choose whether to join the imperial army or return home. And most unbelievable, the empire would assume the foreign debt of the Rio Grande do Sul Republic, 2 million pesos that the Farrapos owed Uruguay and Argentina. Brazil would foot the bill for the revolution against himself. Why? Because Caxias was a genius. He understood what no one in Rio de Janeiro understood. The Farrapos weren't enemies. They were the best soldiers Brazil had. Wasting them would be suicide with Paraguay, arming itself on the border. But it had to look like an imperial victory. So they created a theater. Canabaro arrived without a flag, without an anthem, without republican symbols, as if the Rio Grande do Sul Republic had never existed. 10 years erased in a performance. Caxias dismounted first. A calculated gesture, the victor showing magnanimity. Canabaro dismounted next. The two walked to the middle of the field. The mud was ankle deep. When they embraced, the two armies began to cry. Men who had been killing each other for a decade, crying together because they knew, everyone knew. No one had won. Rio Grande do Sul was destroyed. The empire was shattered. 20,000 dead to change nothing, except that it changed everything. Because in that embrace, something new was born. The Gaucho myth, the regional identity, strongest in Brazil. Forged in 10 years of bloodshed, sealed in a treaty that spoke between the lines of an uncomfortable truth. Rio Grande do Sul was different, special, and Brazil needed it more than it needed Brazil. 5 years later, these same men who were killing each other were marching together toward Paraguay. Caxias commanding Canabaro in the cavalry, Bento Manuel incredibly as a general, united against an external enemy, proving that Brazilians are only united when they have foreigners to hate. But the true end of the Farroupilha Revolution came in 1850 when Bento Gonçalves died. On his deathbed, he called Caxias and said something that a cousin wrote down, but which was only revealed 100 years later. "Forgive us for the blood shed in vain." Those were Bento Gonçalves' last words to Caxias. And when you understand what that "in vain" really meant, your stomach turns. 20,000 dead in combat. That's the official number. But the real numbers that no one counted, get ready. 30,000 civilians died of hunger. When two armies spend 10 years burning crops, killing livestock, poisoning wells, the math is simple. Without food, people die. Children first, old people later. Women trying to breastfeed without anything to eat. Santana do Livramento, 1843. Pre-war population, 3,000 souls. Afterward, 400. They didn't flee. They died of hunger, disease, despair. An entire city wiped off the map. São Borja. Half the houses abandoned to this day, number 1845 today, 2025. 180 years later, entire streets still remain empty because the families that lived there were wiped out. Entire lineages cut short. But the real price isn't measured in the dead. It's measured in the living. José Ferreira da Silva, a survivor of Bagé, never slept a full night again. He woke up screaming until he died at the age of 80. Maria Conceição Piratin spent 40 years without speaking. The trauma of seeing his 5 children die of hunger in a week. Rio Grande do Sul lost an entire generation of men. In some cities, not a single man remained between the ages of 15 and 50. Widows outnumbered married women 3 to 1. Children grew up without fathers. Farms operated by women and children. And the trauma passed from generation to generation. The voice that never spoke about the war. Families who changed their surnames to hide their chosen side. Cousins who never spoke again because they fought on opposite sides. The economy took 30 years to recover. 30 years. Rio Grande do Sul, which was the richest province in Brazil in 1835, only regained that position in 1875. But the worst price was psychological. Rio Grande developed a permanent distrust of central power, an obsessive need to prove itself Brazilian, a complex of simultaneous inferiority and superiority that persists to this day. Do you notice this? How gauchos always need to assert their Brazilianness, as they always have to proving that they are the most Brazilian. It's the trauma of 1845, of almost not being Brazil, of having to choose between being Brazilian or being a gaucho. And Brazil never again completely trusted the South. To this day, army barracks in Rio Grande do Sul are proportionally more numerous than in any other state. Coincidence or institutional memory of when the South rebelled? 500,000 displaced people, families who fled to Uruguay, Argentina, Paraguay, many never returned. Their descendants today are Uruguayans, Argentines, but with Brazilian surnames. Silva Santos Oliveira, living in Montevideo, Buenos Aires, speaking Spanish but dreaming in Portuguese. This is the legacy of the Farroupilha Revolution. And it's not just in neighboring countries. It's here today in your life, that you bear the scars of that war without knowing it. You say, "Tay!" and you don't know it was the Farroupilha password. When a stranger approached the camp, they shouted T. If you answered T, you were an ally. If you didn't, if you knew, you'd carry a spear in your chest. Today you use it to call a friend. Ironic, isn't it? A word born to identify someone you kill has become a symbol of friendship. The gaucho barbecue was born in war, not out of tradition but out of necessity. When you're fleeing the imperial cavalry, you can't carry a pot. You skewer the meat on your sword, put it on the fire, eat and run. Today you think culture is trauma transformed into tradition. You're chimarrão. The Farrapos discovered that yerba mate staved off hunger for a few hours. They drank liters to last days without eating. That circle of chimarrão that seems so welcoming is a collective memory of when sharing a gourd meant everyone was equally screwed. But it goes beyond Rio Grande do Sul. All of Brazil has changed. The national anthem you sing, you'll see that one of your sons doesn't run from a fight. It was modified after the revolution. Before it was "Do not fear the fight." They changed it to "Do not run away" because half the imperial army fled in several battles. They needed to reprogram the national psychology. The Brazilian flag gained the motto "Order and Progress" in 1889. Why? The trauma of 1835, when 7 provinces rebelled simultaneously. Order became a national obsession because disorder nearly destroyed the country. The Brazilian way of avoiding direct conflict, of always trying to find a way, was born there. Because after watching Brazilians kill each other for 10 years, the culture developed antibodies against confrontation. Better the way than the beheading. And today, the ghost of the Farroupilha Revolution is more alive than ever. When you see São Paulo talking about separation, you're repeating 1835. When the South thinks it's special and different, it's echoing the Rio Grande do Sul Republic. When the federal government suffocates states with taxes, it's planting the same seeds that exploded 190 years ago. The same ingredients are all here. Regional polarization, brutal economic differences, a distant central government, regional identities stronger than the national one. Foreign influence, class hatred disguised as politics. The only difference today is the internet. The next Farroupilha revolution won't take 23 days to reach the government. It will be live on Twitter, and it won't last 10 years. It will be much worse or much faster. Do you think it's different, that it's more civilized? Or your great-grandparents thought so too? Until the day they had to choose between killing their neighbor or starving to death. Bento Manuel had stolen the treasure from both sides, but something much more precious was being stolen in those years, without anyone noticing: the innocence of an entire generation. Because in 1844, Rio Grande do Sul was creating something Brazil had never seen and preferred to forget existed: children, soldiers. It wasn't a choice, it was cruel mathematics. After 9 years of war, the cemeteries were filled with men between 15 and 50. Widows outnumbered married women 3 to 1. The boys were 12, 13, 14 years old enough to learn to read, but they were learning to kill. Jose Ferreira, 13, son of a widow from Bahia. His father died defending the Farroupilhas in 1938, his mother from typhus in 1942. In January 44, the Farroupilha patrol found the boy alone, trying to protect the family's abandoned farm with a shotgun bigger than him. They didn't ask if I wanted to fight. They put on a uniform that had to be folded 3 times at the sleeves and sent him to the front line. 3 months later, he was beheaded after surrendering. The empire did not take children prisoners. It was a lot of work to feed, but what turned this war into a factory of children's nightmares was a decision taken simultaneously by both sides, as if the devil had breathed the same idea into different ears. The young black spearmen, slave children, 8, 9, 10 years old, too small to carry real spears. So they made smaller versions. They promised freedom if they survived. Simple and cruel math. A slave child was worth less than a bullet. 2,000 black children fought. Fewer than 100 survived. The empire created Decree 312. Every young person over 14 years old in a rebel zone would be considered fit for service military, but the recruiters did not carry rulers. If the boy could hold a rifle, it would do. Pedro Rodriguez, 11 years old from Rio Pardo, was bringing water to the horses when the Imperial patrol passed by. 2 days later, he was in uniform in São Gabriel. His mother only learned he was alive 6 months later, when a deserter said he saw the boy carrying ammunition while grown men were dying around him. The mothers created a secret protection network. When news of recruitment arrived, they hid their children in holes under steel inside barrels in unlit ovens. Some took desperate measures, cutting off their children's index fingers. Without it, they couldn't shoot. A mutilated son was better than a dead son, but in 44, not even mutilation could save. The war had created imperfect battalions. Lame boys carried ammunition. Boys without an arm played the drums. Blind boys took care of the horses. Francisco Santos, 14 years old, lost his right hand in an explosion, tied a dagger in the stump. They sent him back to fight. The trauma did not wait for the war to end, to destroy these children. Manuel da Silva, 12 years old when he was recruited by the Farroupilhas, survived physically but was never able to sleep a full night again. He woke up screaming until he died at the age of 80, still seeing the faces of the men he killed before he turned 15. You just discovered that Brazil's bloodiest war was caused by taxes on jerky. That 12-year-old children were forced to cut the throats of prisoners. That 300 slaves were massacred by the very commanders who promised freedom. Stop now, answer honestly. Did you know anything about this before today? If the answer is no, you have been fooled for 180 years. And if you were deceived about this, about what else they are lying about, write in the comments right now your city and the word woke up. I need to map how many Brazilians are discovering the truth. Don't scroll, write now. I woke up your city. You know that friend who loves history? The one proud gaucho relative? That teacher who teaches lies without knowing it. Share with them now. Not soon, now, right. This will change everything you know about Brazil. Subscribe to this channel now. It's not about the algorithm, it's about waking up before it's too late. Because this whole story could repeat itself next week. Your finger is 2 centimeters away from the like. Each like is a Brazilian who chose to know the truth. Each share is a family discovering why Brazil is broken. Each entry is someone who will not repeat 1835. There are people watching this who have relatives who fought in that war. Ask now, call your grandfather. Send a message to that old uncle. Someone in your family knows something. And if you know, write in the comments. Yesterday, 1,000 people watched and didn't share. Today, these 1,000 people continue to believe that Brazil is a united country, that we never had a civil war, that we are peaceful by nature. Do you want to keep living this lie? Brazil is dividing again. The same ingredients from 1835 are all here. Regional polarization, hatred between states, distant central government, foreign influence. The difference today is that we have weapons that kill millions, not thousands. Share now before history repeats itself, because next time it won't last 10 years, it will last 10 days. 20,000 won't die, millions will die. Because anyone who doesn't know the real history is condemned to repeat it. And next time it could be your 12-year-old son holding a gun. The choice is yours, but choose now, M.